All right, so our first set of notes is electromagnetic radiation and the photoelectric effect. For this particular set of notes, again, as always, you can use the notes that I've provided for you in Schoology, or you may take your own. And at the end, you'll be doing summary and questions on those, etc., like you always do. All right, so to understand the electronic structure of an atom, we first have to be able to understand electromagnetic radiation. And in order to be able to understand electromagnetic radiation, we have to be able to understand waves. Okay, so different forms of energy travel in waves in our universe. One of those is electromagnetic radiation or light. Here's an example of a water wave, right? Different materials, different forms of energy travel as waves. So some things that you need to know about waves. First of all is the idea of wavelength. So the wavelength is simply the distance between corresponding parts on adjacent waves. So from a crest to a crest, or a trough to a trough, or a peak to a peak, however you want to do that, or a peak on the way up to a peak on the way up. Those are all known as the wavelength, symbolized by the Greek letter lambda. A other key feature that we use to describe waves is frequency. Frequency is represented with a V, and it's the number of waves passing a given point per unit time. Okay, so if you look at these two things that we got here, and if you sort of imagine that from the beginning of the line to the end of the line is a period of time, maybe 1 second, it should be obvious to you that A has a lower frequency than B. Why? A repeats twice, B repeats 4 times. Okay, and for waves traveling at the same velocity, the longer the wavelength, the smaller the frequency. So they're an inverse relationship there. Okay, so now that we understand that, electromagnetic radiation, which is one way that energy is transferred, travels in waves. And depending upon how that wave or the characteristics of that waves, we can end up with different types of electromagnetic radiation, things that you may have heard of, or different ways of energy moving through space, things like visible light that we can see, radio waves, which is what's used to transmit radio signals, infrared, okay, which is the way that heat gets transferred, one way of transferring heat. It's also used in like night vision goggles, as well as X-rays. If you've ever had an X-ray of your body, again, that's a type of electromagnetic radiation. And what makes them different is essentially the wavelength and the frequency of these different types of electromagnetic radiation. Okay? All electromagnetic radiation moves at the same speed, and that is the speed of light. Okay, the speed of light is 3.00 times 10 to the 8th meters per second. It's symbolized by the letter C. Okay, so the other thing that we need to know about electromagnetic radiation is that the wavelengths of them varied pretty dramatically. For example, gamma rays are on the order of having a wavelength of 10 to the negative 12th meters. So that's like the size of the nucleus of an atom. Whereas radio waves are 10 to the 3rd meters, or 1,000 meters. So like a third of a football field. Sorry, 3 football fields, excuse me. So anyway, electromagnetic radiation, different types vary very dramatically based on their wavelength and their frequency. But what do they all have in common? They all have in common that they have travel at the same speed. Which brings us to our question. What travels faster, visible light or infrared? Okay. Well, even though visible light has a slightly higher frequency and shorter wavelength, they're both light, so they both travel at the speed of light. They are the same. So, again, all electromagnetic radiation travels at the same velocity, the speed of light, which is 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second. So therefore, C, the speed of light, equals the wavelength of the wave times the frequency. Okay. And this makes sense because waves are a distance. Frequency is a measure of time, or the inverse measure of time. And so therefore you end up with the speed of light equaling distance over time, which is what we get, which is how we get speed. Okay, so this is an equation that we can use to calculate speed of light, wavelength of electromagnetic radiation, or frequency of electromagnetic radiation. All right, so that's what happens when we think of light as a wave. We think of the waves of electromagnetic radiation, but the wave nature of light doesn't explain everything about what we see happening in the world. So in other words, it doesn't explain how an object can glow when its temperature increases. So scientists had to come up with an explanation for this, and a German scientist by the name of Max Planck explained it by assuming that energy comes in packets called quanta. So rather than increasing your energy or increasing energy of something in a continuous manner, you basically have different levels of energy that electromagnetic radiation can be at. So Einstein used this idea from Planck to explain something called the photoelectric effect. And in doing so, he concluded that energy is proportional to the frequency in an electromagnetic wave. So in other words, the energy equals Planck's constant times the frequency, where 6.626 times 10 to the negative 34 joule seconds is Planck's constant. We're going to take a minute and watch a video to help us understand what the photoelectric effect is about and where Einstein got this idea.
We're in the demo lab with Lonnie, where he set up a photoelectric effect experiment. He has white light impingent on a metal, and the energy of the photoelectrons emitted are shown on the meter at right. If he puts a red filter in the path, now only red photons can strike the metal, and you can see they do not have sufficient energy to eject photoelectrons. If we go to higher energy photons, say go to yellow light, that's shorter wavelength and higher energy photons, they may be able to eject photoelectrons. And indeed, photoelectrons are emitted, but with a relatively small energy. If we go to higher still photon energy, green wavelengths, that's shorter wavelengths still, higher photon energies, we can see photoelectrons emitted at a higher energy. Now we can still go to higher energy photons. Blue photons, photons in the blue region, are the highest energy visible photons, and Lonnie has a blue filter that will pass only blue photons. Putting the blue filter in the path shows photoelectrons emitted at the highest energy. So here's an example of the photoelectric effect. Thanks, Lonnie, for that great demonstration.
So essentially the idea is that if you have and you're shining light on a material, you will get some photoelectrons ejected off of the material based on the energy of the light coming in, okay? And that light energy is proportional to the frequency of the light that's coming in. So if you have something that's got a lower frequency, thus a lower energy, it won't pop electrons off the surface of this metal as easily. But if you have something with higher energy photons, it will pop electrons off more easily, okay? And so there's a measurement at some place along there of what is the energy required to pop a photon off, or an electron off, and whatever that energy is needs to be smaller than the energy of the light coming in. So what's the point? Well, this means then, if you know the wavelength of light, you can calculate the energy of a photon, right? So we know the light energy, the speed of light equation, and we know the energy equation. And so now we can see that those two things are related. If we know the wavelength of the light, we can figure out the frequency, and from that, we can figure out the energy. Let's see how this is done. All right, so ending our conversation about electromagnetic radiation then, we just want to talk about visible light a little bit because it is important in a lot of chemical studies that we'll be doing. And we just need to understand that in terms of visible light, the violet end of the spectrum has a shorter wavelength, a higher frequency, and thus a higher energy. Okay? As we go towards red, we get longer wavelengths and less energy, a lower frequency. Okay, so what is our high energy light? Tends to be towards the purple end, blue-purple end, lower energy visible light towards the red end. And this actually has some application in the real world. If you think about DVD players versus Blu-ray players. Well, DVD players read a DVD by using a red laser on the disc as it comes along, because you can store information that red laser then reads. Okay, but if you want to store more information on here, like a higher quality picture or something like that, you need to be able to get more information on this and thus have a higher energy laser that reads it. Well, how do you do that? You use something from the blue spectrum in order to be able to read that. And that's why we have Blu-ray players, because they are reading more information using a blue laser. Fun fact for you. All right, so we had lots of equations on here. So things that you'll need to know, if you look at your pink reference sheet that you can use on the AP exam, I just want you to be aware of what equations are given to you so you don't go about memorizing them. So they give us these two equations. They don't give us the combined equation between the two of them. In fact, lots of times they ask you to derive that on the AP test from those two equations. But they do give you what everything means, and they give you the values for Planck's constant and the speed of light that we can use. Okay. Note on AP tests, because sig figs are important, use the values that they give on their pink sheets so that your sig figs are correct. All right, so that is an introduction to electromagnetic radiation. Problem set 2B focuses on problems related to this material. But in the meantime, we got another set of information to give today.